Good morning, partners in crime. It is so great to see you guys. Today we have with us Eleanor Kuhns, who is a previous winner of the Minotaur Books Mystery Writers of America first crime novel competition for A Simple Murder. You're the author of 11 Will Rees mysteries, and you're now a full-time writer after a successful career as the assistant director at the Goshen Public Library in New York.
That's right.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's great to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah. So today we're here to talk about your latest book series, which is the Ancient Crete Mystery series and includes On the Horns of Death and In the Shadow of the Bull. Yes. So let's talk a little bit about the Ancient Crete Mystery series.
I'm ready.
All right. So tell us of the backstory and the underlying plot of the series.
The underlying plot follows a girl of about 16 named Martis. Now, why did I choose someone that young? Well, the lifespan in that time was very short. The rule of thumb was you were married in your teens, a mother in your 20s, grandmother in your 30s, and dead in your 40s. Yeah. Plus, in the first book, she is a wannabe bull leaper. What's a bull leaper? It is one of those young people who ran at a charging bull, grabbed their horns, and flipped over their back. And yes, it really is true. If you are in Knossos, there's all kinds of statuary, frescoes, murals, and so forth of figures doing exactly that. And so in the first book, she is in training, and in the second book, she's a full-fledged member of the team. In the first book, her sister, Arj, is supposed to get married to a barbarian, a mainland Greek, and drops dead on her wedding day at the altar. So, of course, Martis immediately has to investigate, especially when the spirit of her sister comes back and asks her to investigate the murder. This is another thing. They believed in this, especially if you were a young woman who died before you got married or had children. You became a Willie, and you would come back and haunt the family. So Arj comes back and encourages Martis to investigate. Then in the second one, On the Horns of Death, Martis goes to practice for bull leaping. Now, we don't know if they practiced or even if they trained the kids. I'm hoping they do, though, because I'm sure it was plenty dangerous even without that. And so Martis is on her way to practice. And when she gets there, she sees her whole team in front of the bullpen. And the bull inside is kicking and snorting and running around. And she gets on her hands and knees and looks through the panels of wood and sees a dead body on the ground. And it comes to pass that that is a member of their team. So she begins to investigate that murder too. So,
wow.
Yeah, I always have loved historical fiction. And I love ancient Greece and ancient Crete and all of that. And right before the pandemic, actually, we went to Crete and I went to Knossos and I saw those frescoes. And we were at the museum, we saw the statuary, and it was like an inspiration to me. So that's when I decided I was going to write something about that time period, a very exotic, woman-centered time period.
Yeah, that's so weird that it's woman-centered. Was it always that way, or was there just a shortened period of time?
Well, the theory is that all the cultures far back, and of course this is Bronze Age we're talking about, were woman-centered because it was all about fertility of the livestock, fertility of the children, and of course fertility of the fields. And it was one of the theories is that the patriarchy actually came from the steppe dwellers who were very patriarchal, and it was all about the horses and the riders of the horses, who were the men, the conquerors. And that swept down over into India, over into Europe. Crete held on to their goddess worship a little longer because they were an island. And of
Mhm.
course, the horse riders didn't have boats. They didn't have boats and they couldn't get to the island. So they think it was everything was woman centered originally. And then it became more patriarchal. And of course, more wars and of
Yeah.
course all of that. So yeah.
So how do you do the research for something like this? I mean, this is 1400 BC.
Yeah. Yes. Well, it was a challenge.
I can imagine.
Will Rees, uh, and a new series that I'm working on now, there's newspapers. I don't think I've ever appreciated newspapers so much in my life. We haven't even deciphered the linear A from the Minoan times. So what I had to do was, of course, I had been at Knossos, but also I kept up with all the latest archaeological research, all the magazines, all the articles, all the journals, so that when I actually came to write the book, I had a whole bunch of information that was the newest, and of course, a whole bunch of theories that I had to pick and choose among to give the story some continuity. So it was
Wow.
a challenge. Yeah.
I can imagine. And like everything that you write could change tomorrow because they could learn something new or dig up something different or it,
That's exactly right. Although it's pretty certain now that it was goddess centered.
Mhm.
That they had a pantheon of gods, but the supreme was a goddess, and that they've dug up seals and they know about the bull dancing. They're pretty sure that there was some male power who ran the city, who was administration official.
Mhm.
And I made Tinos, the consort of the high priestess, to do that. We don't know if that's exactly how it ran. It's one of the theories. Uh, so that's the one I chose. Another thing that they're talking about is there might have been human sacrifice. They're not sure about that. That is another, again, one of the theories. So I've decided not to address that one. So it has been very interesting and I've learned a lot and I'd like to go back to Crete now that I know all of this.
I can imagine. Wow. So, Martis, how do you develop a character so intimately with stuff you just don't know? I mean, you're kind of guessing with.
Well, yes, that's partly true, except that I don't think people change that much.
Mhm.
Uh, I think that even though at 16, she's really on the cusp of adulthood. She really has maybe another year or two before they expect her to get married and settle down and have children. She doesn't want to at this point, but uh, so she is more like, I would say, someone in our time who would be in their 20s. But with that said, she's still partly a kid and she still wants to do adventures and be free. I mean, she spends a lot of time running around town in a boy's kilt. Um, she doesn't really want to grow up yet. And I thought that that is could be, fairly plausible because who does really want to grow up and know that they're going to have the same life as their mother and their grandmother and all of that? She doesn't want that. And I don't think that that's unusual. So that part of it I thought was fairly easy to write. Wanting to be a bull dancer, well, I can understand wanting to do something other than sitting in front of a loom all day. Not sure I would choose to run at a charging bull, but I thought that the bull dancers at that time were probably like the rock stars of today, famous. They got, people throwing money at, well, they didn't really have money, but threw jewels and stuff at them all the time. So if you really wanted to do something exciting and yet would get you fame and fortune, and everyone would know you, that would be it.
The scenes that you wrote with the bull dancing and they were so real. So how did you do that? Have you seen that happen? And
I have not seen that happen. But I actually grew up on a farm in Idaho, so I have seen bulls. Now, our bulls are not the same as those. Those went extinct in the 1600s. They are trying now to uh, kind of pull them back with DNA and special breeding and all of that, like some of the other extinct animals in Europe. And so I looked at pictures of the actual bull, and I knew that they were fast. And if you've ever seen a charging bull in real life, you know that despite the bulk, they move incredibly fast. So I kind of put it all together in my head and came up with what it would feel like, what they smelled like, what it smelled like to have flowers being thrown down into the ring.
it's
So yeah,
amazing. They were so real, those scenes.
thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed writing that series very much.
And do you know if they do that still,
No,
perform that way?
no, that the actual only descendant of that is bullfighting. But
Hmm.
the whole mindset of bullfighting and what they were doing in ancient Crete is different. In ancient Crete, the bulls were sacred and they were a sacred animal, and it was a way of honoring them in a sense to do this. In bullfighting, it's really a contest of power, which is totally different. But the bullfighting is a direct descendant. Nobody does the bull leaping anymore. I guess another descendant might be the running of the bulls in Pamplona, you know,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
kind of thing. But nobody, and who would allow their kids to do it now, right? I mean, Mom, I want to go and run at a charging bull and grab the horns and flip over the back. Oh, okay. Yeah. I don't think that would happen.
I'll buy tickets, honey.
Yeah.
Oh gosh. Yeah, that would be so scary. Um, so what was one of the best things for you in learning about ancient Crete and the history? What is something that you learned that you really didn't expect to?
Well, of course, um, I think one of the things that surprised me so much was how civilized and advanced this society was. Now, we are talking about the Bronze Age, the 1400s BCE,
Hmm.
and they had indoor toilets. It took
Really?
yes, it took millennia before anybody came up with that again. I mean, think about it. They were extremely civilized and sophisticated. That's why Saurus, the groom of Arge, Martis' sister, was considered a barbarian from mainland. They didn't have a lot of this stuff. And when the Mycenae actually took over, they adopted their gods, their culture, everything, but from a kind of different worldview. So they were really incredibly sophisticated and advanced. And I was surprised by that.
It sounds like there was a lot of ancient things for you to look at and to review, though.
Mhm.
So just the magazines and your visit were able to provide what you needed?
Well, not entirely. I mean, when I started writing In the Shadow of the Bull,
Hmm.
I had to start doing more research than I expected, actually. I had an idea about the clothing
Yeah.
because that's in the statuary and the frescoes. And I already knew that the women were tremendous weavers and they traded all around the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anything about how they did that with their ships, so I had to investigate that. Luckily, they know how they did that, and I was able to find that information. So there was a tremendous, tremendous amount of research that came up as I was writing the book of things that I didn't know. And believe me, I had to research the Greek gods more than I would ever have wanted to.
I can imagine. Now, you have one more book coming in this series, correct?
Well, I have one more that I sent to the publisher, but they
Okay.
didn't want to publish it because they said that the sales weren't good enough. Yeah. So I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do with that, whether I'm going to self-publish it or do something different, because I did write it and my beta readers feel that that's the best one. So I don't want to let it go, you know.
And what's the title of that one?
A Murder of Furies.
Oh, yeah, I love your titles and your covers. That they're beautiful.
Aren't they? Yeah, I was very happy with the covers. I thought they really did a good job with those.
Yeah. So I want to divert a little bit and ask you a little bit about Will Rees, because
Mhm.
that was a long running mystery series that you did.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about Will?
Well, of course, I did not expect it to go so long. My thought was that it would go for maybe 5 books.
Oh, uh-huh.
And because it involves a traveling weaver, you know, hand weaving is one of my, well, it used to be one of my hobbies. I really haven't had time since the Will Reef books took off. But so he's a traveling weaver, which was true. Men were traveling weavers before the Industrial Revolution. And uh, my subtitle in my head was the upbringing and the growing up of Will Rees, because even though he's a middle-aged man, he's never really addressed some things. Like he's still suffering from grief over the death of his first wife. He's estranged from his son David. He has anger issues. So he has some strengths too, but I wanted him to evolve over the course of the series. And at the same time, he's very curious and he has a very strong sense of justice. And I felt that as a traveler, he'd be a lot more cosmopolitan than a lot of the people he grew up with who stayed in the same place on the same farm their whole lives. Now, I do have a funny story about the Will Rees books. In fact, that one I've had several funny stories. After the first couple came out, and of course I had Bessie, the horse. I got a letter from someone in South Carolina saying, "Oh my goodness, you drive that poor horse so hard. That horse is so overworked." Now this is a fictional horse in a fictional book.
Yeah.
So I wrote back and I said, "Well, everyone had to work very hard then."
Yeah.
So that was a funny story, because so I guess I did a good job. Excuse me 1 second. So so yeah, it was that one I thought was funny. But I got some other things too, because I was working with a farmer and a farming community.
Yeah.
And I had people write in and say, well, there is a difference between straw and hay. And this is how they used to pull the hay into haystacks. And so that part of it was pretty interesting, because I wouldn't have thought that people still did it the old-fashioned way. They would have a baler, you know.
So you really get a lot of people that write to you and tell you how your books are not the way they would have done that.
Yes, especially with Will Rees. Not
Mhm.
so much with the Bronze Age Crete series. Most of the people who've read it have really loved it. I've gotten complaints like, well, it was too expensive. Okay. Well, I don't have any control over that, you know.
Yeah.
But with Will Rees, I did get people writing in some cases disagreeing with the historical record. Uh,
Oh.
yes, I had a character in one of the books call someone a cracker, and I got a very angry letter saying that that was not a common term. Well, I had documentation that yes, indeed, it was. One of the English men who had been posted to Georgia wrote back a letter and had used that term in the letter. So I did have documentary evidence. So that was pretty interesting because, one of the things you learn when you're writing historical fiction is people think they know things because it's common knowledge, but might not necessarily be true.
Yeah,
So,
it's been very interesting. I was reading the something on the Library of Congress the other day, and it had some old newspapers, and they really, this person spent the night at this person's house, and this person's brother visited for 4 days and left at noon, and this is what they had for breakfast. I That's worse than gossip now. Oh my goodness.
oh yes, but you can, when you're writing, it's wonderful because
I
you
can
learn an
imagine.
awful lot. I mean, after the whole debacle with the arrangement of a truce with England, because England never accepted the fact that this country had fought the revolution. So they came back and they were shanghaiing the ships and impressing all the sailors. So President Washington, that is, sent, uh, you know, a, a man to England and to France, to different places to see if he could work this out.
Mhm.
And the treaty was so poor that they were going to burn John Jay in effigy. So the politics in this country have always been difficult. And when he was the capital was in Philadelphia at that point, not in Washington D.C. And when he was going from New York State down to Philadelphia, he saw himself being burned in effigy all the way down. And one of the newspaper writers said, "God damn John Jay, and God damn all the people who do not goddamn John Jay in the paper." So, yeah. So it was a pretty, you know, vitriolic time.
Wow.
Yeah. So I learned a lot about American history that I didn't know. And one of the things that I found so interesting about the newspapers is even in the North, they're full
Mhm.
of ads for escaped slaves. So I didn't really address it too much until later on when I felt a little more confident because it is such a difficult subject. So that was the death in the Great Dismal and the murder on principle. I dealt with that in more depth, but it's really, to modern eyes, horrifying to see these ads.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. It it's so interesting though to go back through the old newspapers and to see what those time periods were really like,
Mhm.
and what they shared, how their lives were different. And reading the Will Rees mysteries really gives you a picture of a lot of that. You did a lot of research for those.
I did. I did. Of course, being a librarian helps because that's kind of what you do as your job,
Mhm.
and the one thing that I kept running into is I would find something interesting and I'd want to keep doing it. And then, of course, I'd have maybe a sentence in the book, but I would go down these rabbit holes because it was such an interesting thing to investigate. So that's always a danger, I think. And I'm not sure that I was always good about, not doing that. But yeah, I really enjoyed writing the Will Rees too. And maybe now that there's been a passage of time, I'll write one or two more, you know,
I
because
was
I do
wondering why you
enjoy
stopped at 11.
well, I was kind of running out of ideas.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I did not set them all against the Shakers was because I didn't want to get stale.
Mhm.
And uh, the Shakers were a really, really fascinating community. But how many times can you write this basically the same book about the same community with the same characteristics? So that's why I tried to send him out every now and then to go somewhere else and see a different scene, and there are different suspects because you start to get stale.
So you mentioned that he was a hand weaver. So
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about what that really is? I don't think I've ever seen that done.
Okay. Well, a hand weaving is actually the loom is a pretty large piece of equipment, and there's several different kinds. And he would have had to put the loom, which has, your rollers, your treadles, it has to be threaded every time, in his wagon, and he would have had to go from farm to farm because pretty much all the women spun. You would spin linen from flax, or from you would do the wool from the
Yeah.
sheep. And but not everybody had a loom, because a loom was a big and expensive piece of equipment. That's where our word heirloom comes from, because the looms were passed down to the heirs year, for generations in some cases. So women were not permitted to do this. So although there were women weavers, they tended to weave in the house. Whereas someone like Will Rees would go on a huge trip all around and stop at farm after farm and weave whatever the woman had spun during the winter into cloth. So,
Wow. That could
yeah,
take forever.
yes. I would imagine that he would have been a lot faster than I am. But even uh, threading the heddles, which are these long, skinny metal pieces with a little eye, uh, is extremely time consuming. And I would, if he were smart, I would imagine that he would have already had something threaded. You would have had the warp already prepared. So then he would just use whatever fabric, whatever fiber they gave him to do the weft, which goes across. But there would have been times, I imagine, where he would have been at that house for probably a couple of weeks,
Oh, yeah,
depending
that's
on,
fascinating.
yeah, depending. And of course, that is a job that ended with the Industrial Revolution.
Mhm.
And it was already starting to end. When I wrote Death in Salem, I sent him to Salem, and they were already importing fabrics from India. So it was already starting to diminish the need for him and other men like him to do what he was doing. Um, because they were, printed calicos and all this stuff was coming in, and he couldn't duplicate some of that.
Yeah. No, I'm sure like that's something that's, going away and is so interesting and it was so unique. I mean, because everyone's was their print, their fabric, their
That's right. And the really good weavers
Mhm.
would do very, very fine fiber, very fine thread. The woman who taught me would weave silk. I never got to that level. That, I mean, it's like weaving with hair. Oh my goodness, so difficult. And you would do the people who were not as experienced would do twill or diaper or something. But if you were more experienced, you could do much more complicated patterns. And some of the museums, when they have the shows of some of these, boy, they are complicated. I cannot imagine how the weaver kept the pattern in her head. You
Oh,
know.
that's amazing. Well, I have one more question for you before I let you go. And it's you've written a lot of books. So how do you know when your book is done?
Well, that's a good question. I think partly it's I have a couple of people who are my beta readers. Um, and partly it's just when I'm really tired of it that I will say, "Oh, I can't face this again." And then it will go to my beta readers, it will go to the publisher, my agent, and then the publisher, and then sometimes by the time it comes back for edits, I thought of something else and I'll put it in then. So it
Oh,
never really ends.
yes. That's amazing. Thank you so much for visiting with us today, Eleanor. And I think that you teased us with a little bit of what you're writing next. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, the history is really my thing. So I grew up in Yonkers, which is a pretty large city. It shares a border with New York City, actually. So it's right next to the city, and it has a connection to Dutch Schultz, who is a bear, who is a bootlegger and called the Baron of New York City, and he had a brewery in right outside or outside of Getty Square proper. Probably you could get to it in about 10 minutes walk. And how do I know this? Well, when I was working in the Yonkers Public Library, one all of a sudden one day all these manhole covers exploded. Well, he ran beer down to the pier through hoses under the street, as well as having trucks and so forth. And there was still mash and stuff in some of those hoses. And it was fermenting all those years and yeah, exploded. So I started to do research. So I'm going to have the first one, I think, in 1929, and I'd like to do a second one maybe in 1931 at pretty early in the Depression. Um, and I'm going to use a 22-year-old girl who comes from the farm in Dutchess County, because Dutchess was all farms at that point, and moves to Yonkers and gets involved in going to the speakeasies and meets Dutch Schultz. And of course, there are murders and, all of that kind of thing. And it's been very, very fun doing all the old newspapers from that period. And there's still things left from then, In fact, they just had a building that was built right before this collapse on North Broadway. So there's still a lot left there. So it's been fun, and it's kind of like a homage to the city I grew up in.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to see this.
So yeah, so it's with my agent right now, and we'll see what happens.
That's terrific. Thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you for having me. I always love talking about my books.
Oh, we appreciate you visiting. We love reading your books, so you just keep them coming.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And our partners in crime, it was great to have you with us today, and we will see you again soon. Until then, visit Eleanor with the links in our show notes.